All right, can you see me? Okay, Ian. Ian.
Yeah, he can see you.
Right.
Should be able to see.
Well, welcome.
Can you guys speak a bit louder, by the way?
Yeah, I will. I'll shout. Okay. Now, good morning, everybody. This is Stewart.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but you have to speak a bit louder.
You can hear me?
Yeah, but only just.
Only just. Oh, can we get something? Oh. Now, Ian, I've known you for a very, very long time because we were one of the golden age in university. We were one of the big seven to offset sort of Oxbridge and red brick universities. And this one was the University of Sussex. And Ian was there. Didn't do much work, but was very, very interested. He wanted to be a journalist. And we've been friends, lifelong friends. And he's now in London, partly broadcasting his book, which was about his mother. Yeah, a wonderful book about his mother. And it's about, sorry? Hello?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Stewart.
Oh dear. What can you do?
No, we've got the volume up to.
I'm going to ask the questions.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I'll tell you what. Can we? Yeah, your volume is very low.
Oh dear.
Can you turn your volume up?
I can hear you. I can hear you on the right, but I can't hear Stewart. What about the microphone?
Very soft voice. Okay. All right.
Why don't you switch places?
Now try, Stewart.
Hello, Ian. Can you see me now?
Very well. Can you speak a bit? I can hear the other chap very well, but not you.
Well, we'll move around. Okay.
Just ask. Yeah, you'll have to speak louder. That's all.
Okay, I'll speak louder. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Well, my guest today is Ian Gill. He's a lifelong friend because we met at Sussex University, which was a new situation in universities because they sort of became known as Oxbridge.
Hey, look, listen, Stewart.
Yeah.
Stewart.
Yeah.
I think the problem is I do have too much background noise. Can I just try and move somewhere?
Yeah. Right, now, can you see me and hear me?
This is a bit better.
Move over a bit then. That's it. Right.
Okay. Is this a bit better for you?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. There was a bit too much background noise.
Okay. Well, right. Good morning, everybody. This is Stewart Dalby, speaking from Mirador Television. My guest this week is Ian Gill, who is a lifelong friend from Sussex University days, where we were sort of trying to, after Butler's decided to improve tertiary education. So being on Sussex University in the 60s was very, very good to be alive in those days. Anyway, we all paid our patch, and Ian became I think he became a journalist and an author, and also a banker over the years. And what's really coming, well, I'm speaking to him today because he's in London to actually publicise, it must be said, his rather really good book. And perhaps you would like to, and can I just say, England, it's a good about your mother actually writing a book about her lover, and it's about the beginning about China, about the beginning of the Opium Wars and the ending of Mao Zedong, and it's an extremely good book, and I'm obviously giving you a puff. So, but let's go back to your childhood, not your mother's, and as I remember it, you were in Hong Kong. You lived in Hong Kong, didn't you?
That's correct. I mean, that's when the whole idea of the book began. My mother and I decided to have a holiday in Hong Kong. This is
Where were you living?
1975,
Yeah.
Pardon?
Where were you? Where
And
were you? You lived
where
in
was I
UK,
living?
didn't you?
No, at that time, I was actually working in New Zealand as a journalist, and my mother was near retirement in Geneva, and we hadn't seen each other in a while, so we decided to meet halfway in Hong Kong. And I thought it was just going to be a regular holiday. But to my surprise, she started introducing me to a couple of Eurasian friends, for example, from her school in Shanghai, the Shanghai Public School. She introduced me to other people that she'd known from the prison camp, the Japanese prison camp she'd been interned in Hong Kong. And she even we flew to Taipei for a few days where we met her old colleagues from before the war, where she'd worked, with whom she'd worked on a very progressive magazine in Shanghai and in Hong Kong for the Chinese Government Information Office before the war arrived in 1941. So this was a side to her that I'd never seen before. And everybody she met were treating with great warmth and respect. And I thought, well, it must be something interesting here. So basically, we agreed then that we would write a book, and we did decades of research. Of course, I had a full-time job, and I must say that it wasn't just a story about her. She knew her parents very intimately, of course, as mother and father, but she didn't know much about them. And, after she died, it was only then that I began to research because the exponential growth of the internet, I was able to find out much more about the English postmaster who had adopted her and her grandparents. And so the story really is about three generations of our
Yeah.
Anglo-Chinese family in China,
Wasn't
starting
there?
with a couple of. Go on.
Well, when I saw you most recently, you talked about you were supposed to go down to New Zealand, but you had to be dropped off of Manila when you were going. But when back in the day, when you were trying to get away from the Chinese and the Japanese and all the rest of it, that's the case, isn't it? I can remember you telling me all about that, talking about that.
Are you talking about after the war?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, well, after the war, we went down to New Zealand, actually. The ship was her evacuation ship from Hong Kong for the
Yeah,
prisoners of war.
yeah,
It was headed actually for England, but they were going to stop in Manila first.
yeah,
But the doctor on board said to us, by then she was very heavily pregnant with me by then. And the doctor said to her, look, we're going to need a cesarean. And, we haven't got the facilities of this troop ship. Fortunately, in Manila, while we were waiting in the harbor, a New Zealand hospital ship came into the harbor. And after a great to-do, we managed to transfer to that ship. And they took us down to New Zealand, where I was born by cesarean a few weeks later.
yeah.
That's how that happened.
Right. And then I always remember that basically at Sussex University that you always wanted to be a journalist. And you walked around with a journalist Mac, all these journalists in those days used to have these Macs and so forth and so on. And you said, when I I sent out 100 applications for a job, and I ended up in the Crawley Express. So when you walked past me, you said, I couldn't believe that you got a job at the FT, Stewart. Do you remember that?
Well, yes, I did. I mean, you lucked out on your first job. I
Yeah.
actually wrote to nearly 200 newspapers after graduation from Sussex. I sat in a guest house with a copy of the writer's yearbook,
Yeah.
and I sent out all these applications, and I was unsuccessful. And finally, I wrote to the National Union. There was National Council of Journalists, and they gave me a newspaper. At that time, actually, it was a problem because not many newspapers wanted to hire graduates. They
Yeah.
thought they were too expensive. Why hire a graduate at a few quid more than a school leaver?
Yeah.
Anyway, the National Council of Journalists wrote back. They said, listen, things are beginning to change. Of course, the FT was quite different, but things are beginning to change even among the provincials. And they gave me half a dozen people to apply to, and I got 2 interviews and 1 job. My first job was with the Crawley Observer, which I don't believe exists anymore. So I had a much more humble start than you, Stewart.
I don't know about that, as a matter of fact, because it all comes down to ADHD, which nobody knew anything about in those days. Right? I was brought up by a very poor person in Paddington, and I didn't pass the 11 plus because people with ADHD are actually rather very intelligent, first of all, but they're also photogenic. They can actually see things. I mean, I remember we had so somebody said to me, there's no need to actually revise for an exam because I can just see what the answers are. Okay, so but I finally got a job with my ADHD. I got a job at the FT because, again, and the reason I got that place in I had got a very poor degree, and I when I went to London and I was working as a labourer, and on the labouring site there was a copy of the Daily Telegraph which I'd never ever read, and I went to the advertisements, and it says researcher wanted for Financial Times Library, must be a graduate, editorial prospects. And everybody was falling about this. For God's sake, I got a job in one bloody step.
Yes. Well, you were lucky. That was the FT was one of the few publications that required a degree.
Well, no, that's Golden Newton, who was very, very snobbish, remember, very elitist. And he put an ad in the Telegraph saying, if you've got an Oxbridge degree, there's a job for you on the Financial Times. How snobbish was that?
How interesting.
Of
Yeah.
course, you had all the old Oxford people. Gilles Gondier, David Lascelles, all this bloody lot. Oh, really?
Well, anyway, I mean, it all worked out in the end because after the Crawley Observer, I got a job on the Brighton and Home Herald. I don't know if you
Oh, my
remember
God.
that newspaper. Now, I was
Yes.
very happy because I was back in my old hometown of Brighton, where you and I lived when we went to Sussex University. And of course, on a weekly like that, you did everything. You went to court to cover the cases there. We had a village around. I had to go around, these places like Rottingdean and Saltdean and Ovingdean. And I had to produce a whole page of stories from nothing, with just one day's visit. So, you really sort of were working hard to find different stories in these rather sleepy little villages, actually. Um, and then I became friends with the sports editor, and he allowed
Well,
me
the
to go and
Financial
cover
Times,
sports.
right, yeah. And you are now
So,
very
I mean,
successful journalist and author. You work? Didn't
so
you work for the Hong Kong papers?
yes, I did. I was in Hawaii for a mid-career break, taking a master's degree. And from Hawaii, I went to Hong Kong to join Asia Week, which was then
All right.
a new and exciting regional news magazine. And that was, again, a very good experience. And then I joined a business magazine, a regional business magazine called Insight. And I joined them as a reporter, which enabled me to travel around the region doing long stories on prominent businessmen and trying to work out how they'd gotten rich after the war. And on the strength of that, I was offered a job by the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong. And they sent me down to Singapore to be a correspondent there. So I had a lot of luck in Hong Kong with quite prestigious publications at the time. Unfortunately, they're all gone now. Oh, I
Well,
think
the
the
fun,
Asian Wall Street Journal might be online somewhere. Sorry, but
but,
it
but
wasn't the.
when I joined the Financial Times, it was just a city rag. It didn't qualify as a Fleet Street. Well, so it did it. Didn't qualify as a Fleet Street thing because anybody who got to Fleet Street had to do something in the parishes, as it were. So you could get one
Yeah.
because he was such a snob. But the fact is, globalization has turned itself into a great newspaper to this day. And the reason is that the Guardian, it can't go globe in the daily, what's it? Look at it now. It's incredibly successful. And I'm pleased to say, and I shouldn't boast about this, it has a very good pension fund. Because I don't write for them anymore. But actually, I don't know if you read the FT these days, but they seem to ace out all other newspapers because it's like a first division football club. They've got money, they can buy the best footballers, or in this case, buy the great writers, and that's what you've got now with Financial Times.
Well, you're a lucky fellow to have a pension fund from the newspaper days.
Yeah, more than lucky, I tell you that. Yeah. And that's what I'm living off now.
Did you work in Hong Kong, Ian?
Did I what? Sorry.
Did you work in Hong Kong?
Is there work in Hong Kong?
No, did you work in Hong Kong?
Yes. I did just talk about my work for 3 Hong Kong-based publications. They were all regional publications. One was Asia Week, and one was Insight, a business magazine, and then the Asian Wall Street Journal. So I did work there for a few years in the late 70s and 80s, early 80s.
But you're doing. I'm overwhelmed by the number of people, things I see on the television now. You're having lunch here, a event here. What's it here? And now we've got you in down in London, haven't we? To see. Well, I just must get this in that Ian, Leslie, and I will be at the Frontline Club on the 9th. Yeah?
Right. We might get together, we might not. We'll see. Tomorrow's the night of I have to give a talk tomorrow at the Hong Kong Society in London about this book called, Searching for Billy. Yeah. So, and I have some obligations during the day, but let's see what happens. What time will you be at the Frontline Club?
Well, it's my daughter's coming across from California, and she says she's going to be there on Thursday, and it sounds like she'd be right on Thursday. We're just doing it right now at home, and the idea is that she can come and see me, and because I haven't seen her for a long time, and we were hoping that we would actually be able to get together with you, possibly in a Frontline Club, to have a nice chat and things. But it might not be because you're on the other side. You're in Soho, aren't you?
Yes,
Tell us a little bit
I'm
about
near I'm near Dean Street.
Yeah, he has done, but anyway, yeah. Okay, well, tell
But
for
anyway,
my tell and now you tell a bit more about you looking for Lily. Uh,
okay, fine. Well, as I mentioned, after my mother died, we began to discover, and with the growth of the internet, we began to discover a lot more about her father and her grandparents. And it turned out that her grandmother and her father both came from quite ordinary circumstances, but they did quite extraordinary things. And they both made contributions to the society in China. Her grandmother, for example, was a farmer's daughter from Malvern, and she didn't get on with her father because her father, which was customary in those days, I'm talking about the 1830s and 1840s, the fathers often tried to order their daughters to marry men who were older and well off. But the daughter didn't necessarily fall in love with them. And this was the case with Mary Ann. So she escaped this small village in Malvern and went to Southampton, where she became an assistant manager in a waterfront hotel. And there, the owner died soon after she arrived, so she assumed huge responsibilities. So after a few years, she really knew how to run a hotel. And of course, in Southampton, she was meeting all these ship's officers and crew who are coming back from the Far East. Her hotel was right next door to the offices of the P&O, this pioneering steamship company that was sailing all the way to Hong Kong, taking in Singapore and Penang en route. So she had this dream that she would start a hotel or run a hotel, take over and run a hotel somewhere on the China coast. And that's exactly what happened. She went to Hong Kong. She married a P&O steward, and they reinvented themselves. They were both from lower class families, and yet they managed to purchase a hotel that was in distress. A storm had almost washed it into the sea, and they made this hotel one of the best known hotels on the China coast. And when I went there, this place was called Shei Fu, but nowadays it's called Yantai. And when my wife and I went, we were greeted by the local historian and his friends with open arms. They spent every day with us, took us around, took us for lunch, took us for dinner. I said, "Why are you being so nice to us?" And he said, "You are the descendants of the humans of Shefu." I mean, she had helped to put that tiny treaty port on the map. And it brought in, trade, business, and jobs, of course, for the local Chinese. Now, extraordinarily, her eldest son, Frank, also became a great contributor to China. He was raised in Shefu, so he spoke Chinese as well as he did English. And not only that, because he was raised by his ama and all the people are in the hotel, he got to know the Chinese very well. He empathized with them, and he was quite unlike the other British who'd come from usually minor public schools in England. Because in Shefu there were two things. Well, first of all, he joined the customs service, and he came to the attention of Sir Robert Hart, who recognized that Frank, his name was, had these extraordinary qualities of speaking fluent Chinese and understanding them. So a few years later, when Frank was about 20, in his mid-20s, Sir Robert Hart was starting up the China Post Office for the Beijing government. And he chose Frank to go all the way to Chongqing, which was tremendously, thousands of miles up the Yangtze River. This was at a time when steamships couldn't even get up the river. And Frank arrives there and he starts a post office branch. And it's extraordinarily successful. And he moves from there to Chengdu, where again he's successful. But Frank has a major flaw as far as the authorities are concerned, because the post office, like the customs, did not allow its senior staff to marry Chinese women. And so what does Frank do? Frank gets to Chengdu, and one of the first things he does, he marries a Chinese girl, the daughter of a local merchant, and that's a big strike against him. He's no longer acceptable in the clubs of Shanghai and other port cities. Excuse me. And then they go on to have a Eurasian daughter. So that's strike two against him. And because the British want to keep their community as white as possible, believing that they owe their authority to their whiteness. And then he's posted to Xi'an at one end of the Silk Road, and he hears this screaming coming from the next door neighbor house, and it's a girl who's being beaten by a trader who acquired her somewhere along the Silk Road. So one night, Frank can't bear it any longer, and he goes next door. A sum of money is exchanged, and he comes back with Dolly. Dolly's around about 7 or 8 years old, and Frank adopts her. So that's now 3 strikes against him. But they're still not letting him go, because he's pretty indispensable in these remote communities. And then in 1915, he's posted to Changsha. This is a trading port on a river in the middle of China. And in 1916, and I heard this from Dolly, in fact, my mother's elder sister, a Chinese man in a gown appears at the door of Frank and his wife, and he's carrying a bundle. And when they lift the swaddling clothes, there's this tiny, tiny baby. And we think that the parents might have given their daughter to Frank in the hope that with his resources, he might be able to take better care of her. And this baby was my mother. So now Frank has got 4 strikes against him. And she arrives just before a civil war breaks out between the armies of the north and the armies of the south. And Changsha is greatly affected. In fact, he has to barricade his post office against marauding soldiers. But he decides to do something quite extraordinary. He sends his 3 daughters to Shanghai, and he sends them to the best English-speaking schools. This is very unusual, because in China at the time, girls tended to stay home until they got married. So he's sending 3 girls, a Eurasian, a Chinese, and probably somebody, Dolly came from, I think, Russian origins. And he sent them to the top British schools, and they all became very British. My mother went to the Shanghai public schools, or Shanghai public school, which was staffed by these independent-minded English women. They were recruited from England and sent first class on a P&O ship. So these women were tremendous role models. And on top of that, they, apart from studying on the British curriculum, my mother played, sports like hockey and netball, and took part in Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. So she had she came out there fluent, and the result of excellent British education, which she then parlayed into a career. She started with Reuters, where she learned editing, and then she joined a very prestigious magazine, a cultural magazine, that promoted closer relationships between China and the Western world. And she got to know the Chinese scholars with whom she worked. and the Western writers, who came into the office. And everything was going splendidly when the war came. The Sino-Japanese War started in August 1937.
Yeah.
And as the troops approached Shanghai, the staff had to leave. So they fled to Hong Kong, but not before my mother had an extraordinary event happen to her. The Europeans were leaving Shanghai in droves. They were very short-staffed. And one day, early into the war, the mayor of Shanghai called my mother's boss and said, "Look, we've got all these journalists coming to town from all over the world, and I need some help. Can you recommend anybody?" Well, of course, my mother's boss recommended my mother, and off she went to work for the mayor. And this entailed, attending his nightly press conferences and sitting on the podium with him and taking notes that she would then transcribe and would be sent to Chiang Kai-shek. Now, one evening, an aide came onto the podium and whispered into the mayor's ear. And the mayor turned around to my mother and said, "Oh, we've got some bad news. Mr. Chang, our regular news broadcaster, has taken ill." And my mother said, "Well, sorry to hear that." And the mayor said, "Well, it's okay. You'll take his place and you'll be fine." And my mother said, "Mr. Mayor, I've never done anything like this." And he said, "Don't worry, you've got a nice voice." And so after the press conference was finished, they put my mother in a bulletproof jacket and put her in a black bulletproof limousine, which took her to this very nondescript Chinese house. They had to change locations of this radio station every few days to avoid detection by the Japanese. Anyway, so my mother arrives in the studio, and a script is put in front of her. The red light goes on, and she said, "Hi, this is Billy Lee on radio, XGOY from Free China." And she doesn't remember what she read, but after the broadcast, the phone goes, and it's the mayor. And he says, "You did a fantastic job. It's yours for the next several months."
Okay.
And radio was king in those days, and she soon built up a following between, from these young students who were attracted by this very British voice from a young girl. And the mayor had told her, "By the way, we have to give you another name. We can't identify you properly." And there was a well-known actress in those days called Billy Dove. And the mayor said, "Okay, we're going to call you Billy. So Billy Lee you are." And that's how she got a nickname, which stayed with her for the rest of her life.
Lovely. Great story. Thank you. Okay. Ian, is it
To arrive to,
Sorry?
do you want me to go to the Hong Kong part?
Oh, if you must, yeah, okay. Right.
Yes,
Okay, so
I think that is a fascinating story, Ian.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear. We've got time for you to give us a little a brief summary of the Hong Kong part.
Okay.
Okay, so the entire staff regroups in Hong Kong. And apart from running this cultural magazine, they acquire a new function. They become the Chinese Government Information Service. The reason for this is that the national government has been pushed by the Japanese forces way to the far west. The Japanese, they took Shanghai, they took Nanking, and they were heading west. And so the Chinese government, its only voice piece was through Hong Kong. And on the other hand, also the foreign correspondents who are flying into China to cover this war now, they could only go through Hong Kong because all the other ports were occupied by the Japanese. So part of my mother's job, because she had experience with the media, was to accredit these foreign correspondents and facilitate their going into China to the front line. And she met various people, like Ernest Hemingway, for example, who arrived with Martha Gellhorn, and who was his wife, who was the real war correspondent. And she had to help organize their tour around the hot spots of China, including meeting Chiang Kai-shek. And the Chiangs were also, they had a very close advisor in W.H. Donald, who was an Australian correspondent who had become very close to Sun Yat-sen, and after that, the Chiangs. And whenever Donald was able to leave Chongqing and take a break in Hong Kong, she was deputed to work for him as his secretary. And, he would stay at the Gloucester Hotel in Hong Kong, but he would be inundated with calls from journalists. So they decided to work on his small yacht, a gift from Madame Chiang, in Hong Kong Harbor. And that's where she dealt with all these memos he was dictating to leaders around the world. And they would do that in the mornings, and then they'll take a break for lunch, and then she'd jump off the yacht and have a swim. So it was quite a nice and interesting working environment. But it was through that work that she met, for example, Madame Chiang, when she came to Hong Kong to give radio broadcasts aimed at the Americans to raise funds and other support for their battle against Japan. So she had a front row seat on a lot of the interesting action in Hong Kong. And that went on well until December the 8th in 1941, when she was on her way to the office and she heard this distant thudding, and it was the sound of the Japanese dropping bombs on Kai Tak Airport. And that was the beginning of the Battle of Hong Kong, which lasted 3 weeks. And after that, the civilians were ordered to assemble in a big square in Hong Kong, and they were all herded off into an internment camp with nearly 3,000 people. And she spent nearly 4 years in that internment camp.
Right.
Now,
Right.
so
Okay.
in Hong Kong in the 1930s and early 40s, the Chinese and the British generally led separate lives. But my mother was occupying this interesting space where the Chinese government officials were meeting Western journalists. So they were meeting on equal terms and interacting very closely with each other. But outside the office, my mother just became an attractive Chinese girl who was off limits to the young men from the big trading houses and banks, because again, they had this rule where their staff were not allowed to develop serious relationships with the local Chinese. But she was sitting on a beach with a friend in Repulse Bay one afternoon, and with a friend, and two men stopped by and chatted them up. And they were both they were warrant officers with the British Army, and one of them was an Irishman called Paddy, and he was drawn to my mother, and he pursued her for a year, and eventually she succumbed, and she told him at Christmas time in 1940 that she was pregnant. But at that point, she noticed that Paddy's ardor had dropped considerably. So they got married, because mainly because he thought it was the decent thing to do, which is not really how my mother felt about it. And then a few weeks later, the war in England had broken out, of course, in 1939. So a few weeks later, Paddy met my mother and said, "Look, my regiment is being sent back to England. So I'm leaving in a few days. Now, please do not follow me. So he was, in effect, to her complete bewilderment, ending the relationship. And she went on, and a few months later gave birth to my older half brother, Brian. And so when war broke out, Brian was about 18 months old, and she went into an internment camp with Brian. So she had the responsibility of looking after a young child as well as herself while living in a bungalow with 50 other people and living on a diet of 2 meager, watery bowls of gruel twice a day. However, at least Brian gave her a focus and a reason for getting up every day. And they somehow survived quite well until one day in May 1944, they had a system there where nurses could relieve mothers of their children and give them a break. And 2 nurses arrived and told my mother that they were going to take Brian down to a beach, which the Japanese had opened up for the internees. So my mother went off and she was playing bridge with some friends in another bungalow. And suddenly one of her friends appeared at the door, and he'd been walking very fast. He was short of breath. He was white-faced, and he looked at my mother and said, "Billy, come with me." And she was immediately, terrified. And she looked at him and she said, "Stephen, what is it? What is it? Is it Brian?" And he didn't say anything. He just said, "Come with me." So she followed him. He had very long strides, and she was a very short woman, very short strides, and she was trying to keep up with him, at the same time praying as hard as she could that nothing would be amiss. And they arrive at the beach, and she sees Brian being held by another woman, and he thinks Brian's asleep, but it turns out he's drowned. He drowned in a very shallow wading pool on the beach while the nurses were distracted. Now, she's all alone in the camp, and she doesn't really remember what happened in the weeks that followed. But there was one friend who kept coming by and just keeping her company. He was a journalist called George, and he had known her before the war, and she just hung around. And he wrote a poem about Brian, and this deeply moved her. And as the weeks became months, my mother told me many, many years later, she said, when Brian died, I was losing my mind with grief. I just couldn't live with myself. And I needed to replace him. And so the relationship between George and my mother went on a higher level. But there were problems. One was that the diet was so poor in the prison camp that the women had ceased menstruating. And this included my mother. And then, in September 1944, the war was going badly for the Japanese, and they released these Red Cross parcels into the camp for the first time in years. And these were quite substantive parcels, corned beef and sardines and chocolate. And after a while, my mother's natural rhythm returned. Now, the last year of the war was the worst. The food situation had become really, really bad. And the odd bits of fish and meat that had been thrown into the gruel had disappeared. And the doctors had a new warning for the women in the camp. They said, do not get pregnant. You will die from severe anemic deficiency. And they just drummed this message home. And then in March 1945, my mother went to see the camp doctor, Dr. Smalley, and he examined her. And then his face went very serious. He said, "Billy, I've got some very grim news for you. You're pregnant." And her face broke out into a huge smile. She said, "Wonderful, wonderful." Now, from that moment, she said, George and I were the happiest couple in Stanley Camp. And,
Ian, I think taking it to that level, when is your lecture?
sorry, when was this?
When is your lecture? You're giving a lecture on this. When is your talk?
Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Do you want to ask me a question?
Aren't you giving a talk on
This weekend.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Stewart. I don't understand what you're saying.
When is your talk?
Oh, sorry. The talk is on May the 9th, which is tomorrow.
That's when I'm going to be there. That's where I'm going to be there. So
That's right.
hopefully we can meet up. Yeah.
And is the talk at the Frontline Club?
Yes, the talk is being.
No.
There's a society here called the Hong Kong Society, and they're holding their second annual book fair tomorrow at in Soho. It's at Anne's Church in Soho, and they have a panel of 4 authors and a moderator, and I've been invited to be on the panel to talk about my book.
But we should be there, Ian. Me and Leslie should be there.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I think you painted a fascinating picture, so our viewers will get a good idea of the story you're going to tell, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Can I just mention the name? It's called Searching for Billy, and it's available from the online booksellers.
Right.
Yeah, that's terrific. Mention the name again, please, Ian.
Okay, I see Stewart is leaving. Are we wrapping this up?
Well, it's okay. We're still on the air. Just mention the name of the book again.
Sorry?
Name of the book.
Mention the name of
The
the
name
book
of the
again.
book is Searching for Billy.
Right.
Yeah.
Billy is spelled Billie.
Yeah, Ian, hoping we can get together on tomorrow, on the 9th. We could come to Soho, or you could come to Okay.
Right.
All right.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a fascinating account of your history, as it were.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Cheerio.
Good to talk to you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Stewart has left. And
Hang on.
so I think that was a fascinating. Most of us would not have any knowledge of China in Japanese occupation, and there's a human approach to it. So, Stewart, are you ready? Can I say goodbye?
Yes, goodbye now. I'll see you later.
Right, you are. Right, so
Thanks, Ian.
That's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Until then, toodle pip. Toodle pip indeed. Oh, no, hang on. I need to tell you about the pub quiz, which is this Sunday evening at 8 o'clock. £2. Great value for money. And don't forget the Sunday lunch at the Black Horse. Also great value for money and very delicious. So for the moment, we'll say cheerio and thanks for being with us.